Somewhere in your garage right now, there is probably a bag of soil conditioner you bought for $80, tore open with hope, spread across your garden bed, and 3 weeks later, your ground is still cracking like old concrete, still repelling water, still strangling every root that dares to grow deeper than 2 inches. You did everything the label told you. You followed the instructions, and nothing changed. Now picture this: a farmer in the Sahel region of West Africa, so in one of the harshest, driest, most unforgiving stretches of land on earth, walks out to his field with nothing but a sharpened wooden stake and a bundle of dry straw he gathered for free. No amendments, no machinery, no $80 bag of anything. He kneels down, drives that stake into the cracked clay ground, pulls it out, stuffs a fistful of straw into the hole, and moves on to the next spot. He does this across his entire plot in a single afternoon. And 60 days later, his soil is soft, dark, and alive, while his neighbor, who did nothing, is still staring at a field that looks like the surface of Mars. That image should make you angry, not at the farmer, at the fact that nobody told you this was possible, because this technique is not folklore, it is not guesswork. Modern soil science has gone back and studied exactly what that wooden stake and that handful of straw are doing underground. And the results are the kind of thing that a $170 billion industry would very much prefer you never read about. That number is not an accident. $170 billion. That is the current size of the global agricultural mechanization market. The machines and soil products sold every year to people who were told that fixing broken earth requires equipment, expertise, and a credit card. And somewhere inside that $170 billion ecosystem, the knowledge of what a $3 bundle of straw can do has been quietly, consistently, conveniently left out of the conversation. You are not bad at gardening. You are not working with impossible soil. You have simply been navigating a system that profits from your dependency. And today, that changes. The story of vertical straw chimneys does not begin in a laboratory. It does not begin with a university grant or a peer-reviewed paper. It begins in desperation, in the kind of desperation that only comes when the ground beneath your feet refuses to feed your children. Across the ancient farming communities of the Middle East and the Sahel belt stretching from Senegal to Sudan, clay soil was not a problem to be solved with money. It was simply the reality of existence. These were civilizations that had no choice but to understand the earth at a level that modern gardeners, surrounded by products and solutions, have never needed to develop. And so they watched. They observed what happened to soil after termite colonies moved through it. They noticed that land near old root systems, where trees had died and their roots had rotted away, stayed softer, absorbed rain faster, and produced stronger crops long after the tree itself had disappeared. They were not reading textbooks. They were reading the ground. Somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, farmers in what is now Iran and Iraq began deliberately mimicking this pattern. They used hardwood stakes to drive vertical channels into compacted clay fields before the rainy season, then pack those channels with organic material, dry grass, straw, even bundled reeds, so the holes would not simply collapse back in on themselves. The logic was simple and brilliant. If nature loosens soil from the inside out through roots and burrowing creatures, then humans could accelerate that process manually. They were not fighting the soil. They were giving it a doorway. This practice moved along trade routes. Variations of it appeared in North Africa, in parts of the Indian subcontinent, in the terraced fields of pre-Columbian South America, where farmers drove chonta palm stakes into hardpan clay before planting season. It was never written down in a single definitive text. It lived in the hands of farmers, passed from parent to child, embedded in seasonal ritual rather than formal instruction. That is precisely why it was so easy to erase. In 1943, the Rockefeller Foundation launched what would eventually become known as the Green Revolution, a coordinated, well-funded push to modernize global agriculture through hybrid seeds, synthetic fertilizers, and mechanized tillage. By the 1960s and 1970s, the message reaching farmers across the developing world was consistent and loud. The old ways are inefficient. The tractor is progress. The rototiller will solve your soil problems faster than any technique your grandfather used. International agricultural programs poured funding into mechanization infrastructure. Extension agents arrived in villages with pamphlets promoting powered equipment and chemical soil conditioners. And the farmers who had been packing straw into clay holes for 3,000 years were told, politely but firmly, that they were doing it wrong. Within a single generation, the knowledge collapsed. Not because it stopped working, but because the institutions that controlled agricultural education had no mechanism and no incentive to preserve it. A technique that requires a wooden stake and free organic material does not generate licensing fees. It does not move product. It does not appear in a sales catalog. And so it disappeared, not into the past, but into the silence between what is profitable to teach and what is true. What was lost in that silence is only now beginning to be recovered. And what researchers have found when they went looking is more interesting than anyone expected. To understand why vertical straw chimneys work, you first need to understand what is actually happening inside compacted clay soil, because most gardeners have been told the wrong story about why their ground is failing them. The common explanation is mechanical. Clay soil, the story goes, has tiny particles that pack together too tightly, leaving no space for water or roots to move through. The solution, therefore, is also mechanical. Break it up, add grit, force space into existence. This is the logic behind rototillers, garden forks, gypsum amendments, and the entire category of products sold under phrases like soil conditioner and clay breaker. It is a story about physics, and it is incomplete in a way that has cost gardeners enormous amounts of time, money, and frustration. Because the deeper problem with compacted clay is not physical, it is biological. When soil becomes compacted, whether through foot traffic, heavy rainfall impact, repeated tilling, or simply years of neglect, the first thing that changes is not the texture. It is the oxygen content. Compacted soil loses its pore space, and pore space is where air lives. As oxygen levels drop below roughly 10% in the soil atmosphere, something shifts in the microbial community underground. The aerobic bacteria, the organisms responsible for breaking down organic matter, fixing nitrogen, and building the crumbly, fertile structure that healthy soil is known for, begin to die off or go dormant. They are replaced by anaerobic bacteria, organisms that thrive without oxygen and produce as their metabolic byproducts a suite of compounds toxic to plant roots: hydrogen sulfide, methane, various organic acids that lower soil pH and chemically burn tender root tissue. This is not a slow process. Research from the University of California Davis Soil Ecology Program has shown that oxygen depletion in compacted soil can shift the dominant microbial population from aerobic to anaerobic within as little as 48 hours after heavy saturation. What looks like a drainage problem from the surface is, 6 inches underground, a biological catastrophe unfolding in real time. And then the earthworms leave. Earthworms are not simply beneficial visitors to healthy soil. They are among its primary architects. A single earthworm passing through the ground leaves behind a lined burrow coated in mucus and castings that acts as a permanent drainage channel, an inoculation site for beneficial fungi, and a pathway for root penetration. Studies from Rothamsted Research in the United Kingdom, one of the oldest agricultural research stations in the world, have documented that soil with active earthworm populations has infiltration rates up to 10 times higher than soil without them, meaning it absorbs water 10 times faster, holds structure 10 times better, and supports root systems that are measurably deeper and more productive. When anaerobic conditions develop, earthworms do not adapt. They move on or they die. And when they leave, they take with them the entire infrastructure they were building. What remains is a closed system. No oxygen entering, no earthworms working. Anaerobic bacteria producing toxins. Roots confined to the top 2 or 3 inches of soil where trace oxygen from the atmosphere barely reaches. Plants surviving but never thriving. Always one dry week away from stress. Always struggling against a ground that has chemically and biologically turned against them. You can pour water on this soil and watch it puddle and run off because the compaction has destroyed the vertical channels that would carry it down. You can add compost on top and watch it sit there, because without biological activity below, there is nothing to incorporate it. The surface looks like a garden. 6 inches down, it is a dead zone. This is the soil that $80 bags of gypsum are sold to fix. And here is the honest limitation you need to know before we go any further. Chemical amendments like gypsum do work, slowly, partially, and only at the surface. Applied correctly over multiple seasons, gypsum can improve the flocculation of clay particles, meaning it encourages them to clump into larger aggregates with more pore space between them. But it cannot restore the biological community. It cannot bring the earthworms back. It cannot reestablish the fungal networks or the aerobic bacterial colonies that make soil genuinely alive rather than merely less compacted. It addresses the symptom and leaves the disease untouched. To fix what is actually broken, you do not need a bag of anything. You need a door. The genius of vertical straw chimneys is not that they break up clay. It is that they do something far more elegant. They create the conditions under which the soil breaks up itself. When you drive a steel bar or a sharpened stake 30 centimeters into compacted clay and pack that channel with dry straw, you have just done something that no rototiller, no garden fork, and no chemical amendment can replicate. You have opened a direct line of communication between the surface world and the dead zone below. Oxygen travels down. Rainwater follows the channel instead of sheeting off the surface. And for the first time in perhaps years, the soil at depth is no longer sealed from the atmosphere. The immediate effect is chemical. Within the first 72 hours after installation, oxygen concentration in the soil surrounding each straw column begins to rise. Anaerobic bacterial activity starts to suppress. The toxic byproducts, the hydrogen sulfide, the organic acids, begin to dissipate as the chemistry of the surrounding soil slowly tilts back toward aerobic conditions. This is not dramatic or visible from the surface, but 6 inches underground, the entire biological calculus is shifting. Within the first 2 weeks, the straw itself begins to attract microbial attention. Dry straw is rich in carbon. It carries a carbon-to-nitrogen ratio of roughly 60 to 80 to 1, which makes it an extraordinarily valuable food source for the fungi and bacteria that are now beginning to recolonize the oxygenated zone around each column. Fungal hyphae, those white thread-like filaments you sometimes see when you turn over rich compost, begin threading outward from the straw into the surrounding clay. These hyphae do not just feed on the straw. They physically penetrate clay aggregates, secreting enzymes that break chemical bonds between clay particles and releasing a glycoprotein called glomalin that acts as a natural soil glue, binding particles into stable aggregates with genuine pore space between them. One straw column surrounded by an expanding network of fungal hyphae begins restructuring the clay in a radius around it that no mechanical tool could achieve without destroying the very structure it is trying to build. And then between 3 and 6 weeks in, the earthworms arrive. They follow the oxygen gradient. They follow the fungal activity. They find a vertical channel already preformed, already lined with partially decomposed organic material, already inoculated with the microbial community they depend on, and they move in. A single earthworm traveling down a straw column can extend that channel another 20 to 40 centimeters below where your stake reached, coating the walls with castings that permanently stabilize the tunnel and seeding the deep soil with aerobic biology for the first time in years. Where you made one hole, the earthworm makes 10. Where you reach 30 centimeters, the earthworm reaches 60. You did not fix the soil. You gave the soil the tools to fix itself, and then you got out of the way. This is the fundamental difference between vertical straw chimneys and mechanical tillage. And it is worth pausing here because this is the moment that should genuinely change how you think about your garden. When a rototiller passes through compacted clay, it fractures the soil mechanically. It creates temporary pore space, but it also destroys the fungal networks that were beginning to form, severs the earthworm tunnels that existed, and exposes the broken aggregates to the surface where they will, without exception, recompact under the next rainfall, often harder than before. Tilling is a cycle of dependency. It forces you to come back, season after season, with the same machine, paying the same rental fee because it treats the symptom while actively preventing the cure. The $170 billion agricultural mechanization industry does not sell you a rototiller once. It sells you the need for a rototiller forever. Here is where you need to hear something honest. Vertical straw chimneys are not a miracle, and they are not instant. In soil that has been chemically damaged by herbicide residue or heavy metal contamination, the biological recovery this technique depends on may be severely limited. In ground that has been compacted by construction equipment or concrete runoff, the clay structure itself may be too disrupted for fungal colonization to gain a foothold quickly. This method works best in soil that is biologically suppressed rather than chemically poisoned. Ground that still has the memory of life in it, even if that life has gone quiet. If your soil smells strongly of sulfur or shows persistent gray or blue-gray coloring at depth, you may need to address contamination before this technique can do its work. But for the vast majority of gardeners dealing with ordinary compacted clay, the kind that came with a new house or developed over years of foot traffic and heavy watering, this technique is not a supplement to your soil rehabilitation strategy. It is the strategy. And the person who figured that out most clearly was not a soil scientist. It was a farmer with a stick and nothing left to lose. That farmer understood something that a $170 billion industry has spent decades trying to make you forget. That the most powerful force in your garden is not the product you buy. It is the biological intelligence already living in your soil, waiting for a door to open. You are about to build that door, and it will cost you $3. Let us talk about who benefits when you do not know what you just learned. In 2023, the global agricultural mechanization market was valued at $172 billion. That number is projected to reach $247 billion by 2031. Soil amendment products, the bags of gypsum, the clay breakers, the conditioners, the pH adjusters lining the shelves of every garden center, represent a separate market valued at over $4 billion annually and growing at roughly 6% per year. These are not small numbers. These are the financial architecture of an industry whose continued growth depends, structurally and mathematically, on you believing that your soil problem requires a purchase solution. To be precise about what that means in practical terms, the average homeowner dealing with compacted clay soil will spend between $150 and $400 over 2 to 3 seasons trying to fix it through conventional retail methods. Bags of conditioner, a rototiller rental at $65 to $85 per day, perhaps a cubic yard of imported topsoil at $45 to $90 delivered. Against that, vertical straw chimneys cost between $2 and $5 in straw, assuming you cannot source it free from a nearby farm or stable, and require no equipment beyond something long and pointed that most households already own. The performance gap between these two approaches, based on soil infiltration rates, earthworm return, and measurable root depth at 90 days, does not favor the expensive option. It does not even come close. So why does nobody talk about this? Why does the agricultural extension system, the gardening media, the YouTube algorithm, the hardware store staff, the landscaping industry, why does none of it point you toward a sharpened stick and a handful of straw? The answer is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. There is no single room where executives decided to suppress this knowledge. The suppression is structural. It is built into the incentive systems of every institution that touches agricultural education. University soil science programs receive funding from agribusiness. Agricultural extension services were largely rebuilt during the Green Revolution era around a mechanization and chemical input model that has not been fundamentally updated in 50 years. Garden media, magazines, websites, YouTube channels, are monetized through product advertising, a technique that requires no product, generates no advertising revenue, no affiliate commission, no sponsored content opportunity. The silence around vertical straw chimneys is not the result of malice. It is the result of a system in which the truth about a $3 solution is simply not profitable enough to repeat, and that $172 billion industry does not stay that size by accident. It stays that size because every season, a new generation of gardeners encounters their first compacted clay bed, walks into a garden center, and is handed a bag of something. They are not lied to outright. They are simply never shown the door that costs nothing. You have now seen it. And the fact that you are still watching means you already understand that what you do with that information is not just a gardening decision. It is a statement about whose knowledge you trust. Now we build the door, and the entire process, start to finish, will cost you less than a cup of coffee. The materials list is almost embarrassingly simple. You need something long, straight, and strong enough to penetrate compacted clay without bending. A steel crowbar works best, but a sharpened hardwood stake at least 35 centimeters long will do the job equally well. You need dry straw or dry grass, rice straw, wheat straw, barley straw, or any coarse dry grass you can gather from the edges of your property. Avoid hay, which contains seeds that will germinate in your soil channels and create more problems than they solve. Avoid fresh green material, which will mat and compact inside the hole rather than maintaining the open column structure you need. Dry, coarse, and carbon-rich is the goal. A standard straw bale from a farm supply store costs between $4 and $8 and contains enough material to treat 15 to 20 square meters of garden bed. If you live near a stable, a rice farm, or a wheat field, you can likely source it for nothing at all. That is your entire supply list. Everything else is labor, and the labor is lighter than you think. Begin by marking your grid. Across the surface of your compacted bed, you want your straw columns spaced approximately 20 to 25 centimeters apart in every direction, close enough that the fungal networks expanding outward from each column will eventually meet and merge, creating a continuous underground web rather than isolated pockets of recovery. For a standard garden bed of 1 meter by 2 meters, this means you will be making somewhere between 30 and 40 holes. The entire installation for that bed will take you less than 45 minutes. Drive your crowbar or stake straight down into the soil with firm, vertical pressure. Do not angle it. Do not wiggle it side to side to widen the hole. This compacts the walls of the channel rather than opening them, which defeats the purpose entirely. Push straight down to a depth of 28 to 32 centimeters, then pull straight back up. What you are left with is a clean vertical channel whose walls have been displaced outward rather than fractured, creating a zone of microfracture around the hole that will serve as the initial colonization front for fungal hyphae. Now take a pinch of dry straw, roughly the diameter of your thumb, and feed it into the hole. Pack it firmly enough that it holds its position, but not so tightly that you are sealing the channel. You want the straw to fill the hole while still leaving microscopic air pathways along its length. If you have pushed it incorrectly, the top of the straw column should sit flush with or just slightly below the soil surface. This matters because a straw column protruding above the surface will wick moisture away from the hole rather than directing it downward, and it will also be displaced by foot traffic or watering. Move to the next mark on your grid and repeat. The rhythm of the work is almost meditative once you find it. Drive, pull, pack, move. Drive, pull, pack, move. Across a 1 meter by 2 meter bed, you will complete the installation in a single session without breaking a genuine sweat. Once all columns are in place, water the entire bed slowly and deeply. This first watering serves two purposes. It settles the straw columns into their final position and begins the initial moisture migration downward through each channel. The first time, possibly in years, that water has moved vertically through this soil rather than pooling at the surface and evaporating. Do not flood the bed. A slow, steady application for 5 to 8 minutes with a gentle spray is sufficient. You are not trying to saturate the soil. You are introducing the system to its first conversation between the surface and the deep. For the first 2 weeks, water over your straw columns rather than between them whenever possible. This directs moisture consistently into the channels during the critical early phase when microbial colonization is beginning around each column. If it rains heavily, do nothing. The channels will do their work automatically, directing water downward precisely when and where it is needed most. This self-directing quality is one of the most underappreciated aspects of the system. Unlike surface amendments that wash away or evaporate, vertical straw chimneys intercept water at the moment it arrives and route it to the depth where roots actually need it. Within the first week, if you crouch down and look closely at the surface around your straw columns after a light rain, you will likely notice something small but significant. The soil immediately surrounding each column will absorb moisture visibly faster than the soil between columns. The surface will be darker, wetter, and slightly softer in those zones. This is not imagination. This is the first measurable evidence that your underground system is already working, that the channels are open, the water is moving, and somewhere below the surface, the biological machinery that has been dormant in your soil is beginning, very quietly, to wake up. The first thing most people do wrong after installing vertical straw chimneys is exactly the same thing they did wrong before. They expect the ground to change the way a product changes it, fast and visible and reassuring. They check the soil after a week, find it still firm between the columns, and conclude that nothing is happening. This is the wrong way to read the system, because almost everything that matters in the first 60 days is happening where you cannot see it, at a scale measured in millimeters and microbial generations. And the surface will be the last place to show what the underground has already accomplished. Here is how to read the timeline correctly. By the end of week 2, the soil within roughly 3 to 5 centimeters of each straw column will have begun to shift in moisture retention. If you push a finger into the ground beside a column after a dry day, it will feel slightly cooler and marginally softer than the soil at the same depth midway between columns. This is not dramatic, but it is real, and it is the first physical evidence that the oxygen and moisture gradients around each column are already restructuring the immediate environment. By the end of week 4, you may begin to see the first surface signs of fungal activity, a faint white or pale yellow discoloration at the very top of some straw columns where they meet the soil surface. This is mycelium. It is not mold in the harmful sense. It is the leading edge of the fungal network that is threading outward through your clay at approximately 1 centimeter per day, secreting glomalin, binding aggregates, and opening pore structure in a radius that is doubling in size every week. Do not disturb it. Do not add fungicide. Do not water directly onto it with high pressure. It is doing the most important work in your entire garden at this moment, and it costs nothing and requires nothing from you except to be left alone. By the end of week 6, in soil that was biologically suppressed rather than chemically damaged, you will almost certainly find earthworms. Not at the surface, inside the soil, concentrated around the straw columns. If you carefully extract one column at this stage, pulling the partially decomposed straw out intact, you will likely find earthworm castings coating the lower third of the channel and evidence of lateral tunneling extending outward from the base. The earthworms have not just arrived. They have already begun extending the system beyond what you built, drilling downward and outward, carrying the aerobic biology deeper into the clay profile than your crowbar ever reached. At 60 days, do a simple infiltration test. Clear a small area between 2 straw columns and pour 500 milliliters of water, roughly a standard water bottle, onto the surface. In the compacted clay you started with, that water would have pooled for 30 to 90 seconds before beginning to absorb, and a significant portion would have run off entirely. In recovered soil at 60 days, the same 500 milliliters should disappear into the ground in under 10 seconds. That number, the difference between 60 seconds and 10 seconds, represents a change in infiltration rate that no bag of soil conditioner applied once has ever consistently delivered. There are 3 errors that will slow or stall your results, and all 3 are worth knowing before you make them. The first is using straw that is too fine or too decomposed at the time of installation. Partially rotted straw collapses under the pressure of the surrounding clay within days, sealing the channel before the fungal colonization has had time to stabilize it. You need material coarse enough to hold its structure for at least 3 to 4 weeks. Enough time for the biological infrastructure to take over the structural role the straw is temporarily playing. The second error is installing columns too far apart. At spacings greater than 30 centimeters, the fungal networks expanding from adjacent columns may not meet within the first season, leaving dead zones between them where the clay remains anaerobic and the recovery stalls. Tighter is always better. If you are working with particularly severe compaction, drop your spacing to 15 centimeters and accept that the installation will take longer. The investment of time is worth it. The third error, and the most common, is tilling between your columns partway through the season because the surface still looks hard and you lose patience. This is the single action that will undo everything. Tilling at week 4 severs the fungal networks at exactly the moment they are approaching their maximum expansion rate. It collapses the earthworm tunnels that have just been established. It reintroduces the surface compaction cycle that the columns were designed to bypass. If the surface of your bed looks unchanged at week 4, that is not a sign that the system has failed. It is a sign that the system is doing its most important work underground, exactly as designed, and the surface will catch up when the biology below is ready to support it. What you are building with vertical straw chimneys is not a treated bed. It is a recovering ecosystem, and ecosystems do not recover on a schedule that fits human impatience. They recover on the schedule of fungi and earthworms and aerobic bacteria finding each other in the dark, which, as it turns out, takes almost exactly 60 days. There is a farmer in Burkina Faso named Yakuba Sawadogo who, in the 1980s, watched the Sahel slowly turn to dust around him while international aid organizations arrived with bags of fertilizer and government programs promoted mechanized tillage as the path to food security. He didn't either. Instead, he went back to a technique called zayi, an ancient practice of digging small planting pits and filling them with organic material to concentrate moisture and biology exactly where seeds needed it most. He added his own modification. He dug his pits deeper than tradition dictated, and he packed them with dry organic matter to create vertical channels into the hard pan below. Within a decade, Yakuba had turned 12 hectares of classified desert, land that official government surveys had written off as permanently unrecoverable, into a thriving forest garden producing food, harboring wildlife, and recharging the local water table. He did not have a grant. He did not have machinery. He did not have a $172 billion industry behind him. He had a hand tool, dry organic material, and knowledge that the institutions around him had decided was no longer worth preserving. In 2006, he won the Right Livelihood Award, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel Prize, for demonstrating that degraded land could be restored through traditional ecological knowledge at a cost that any farmer on Earth could afford. The organizations that had been selling fertilizer to his neighbors for 20 years did not issue a press release. That story is not a metaphor. It is a data point. It is evidence that the gap between what the agricultural industry tells you is necessary and what is actually necessary is not a gap of a few percentage points. It is, in some cases, the difference between a dead desert and a living forest. And the technique at the center of that story, driving organic material vertically into compacted ground to restore the biological infrastructure below, is the same principle you have just spent the last hour learning to apply in your own garden. You are not Yakuba Sawadogo. Your garden bed is not the Sahel. But the principle does not change with scale. Compacted, anaerobic, biologically suppressed soil responds to the same intervention, whether it covers 12 hectares in West Africa or 12 square meters behind your house. Oxygen reaches the dead zone. Water follows. Fungi colonize. Earthworms arrive. The soil remembers how to be alive. The knowledge you now carry costs you nothing to acquire and will cost you almost nothing to apply. That is not an accident of this particular technique. It is a pattern. The most durable, effective, and ecologically sound methods in agriculture have almost always been the ones that require the least purchasing. They survived for thousands of years precisely because they were accessible to people with nothing. They were pushed to the margins precisely because they were not profitable to sell. And they are being recovered now, slowly and imperfectly, by people who decided that the bill of goods they had been sold did not match the results they were getting. If you share this video, you are not doing this channel a favor. You are doing the next gardener a favor. The one who is standing in a garden center right now, holding an $80 bag of clay conditioner, about to spend money on a problem that a handful of straw could solve. Every person who sees this before they make that purchase is one fewer person who spends a season frustrated and convinced that they simply are not good at growing things. You are good at growing things. You are just missing information that someone decided was not profitable enough to give you. Subscribe if you believe that information should belong to the people who need it, not to the industry that profits from their not having it. That is not a small idea. In a world where agricultural knowledge is increasingly locked behind paywalls, branded products, and proprietary seed systems, choosing to share freely is a form of resistance that costs nothing and compounds with every person it reaches. Next week, we go underground again. But this time, we are looking at a practice from ancient Korea that uses a single fermented liquid, brewed at home for under $4, to inoculate your soil with a biological diversity that commercial probiotics charge $60 a bottle to approximate. The industry calls it impossible to replicate at home. The science says otherwise. We will show you exactly why.